just wait for the system. Okay.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hello and good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Rachel Loney. I'm the country director of the British Council in Italy. And you are all very welcome to this webinar, which is called Interpreting the Museum, Working Methods and Interpretation Strategies for the Redisplay of the Burrell Collection, Glasgow. The event is in collaboration with Ecom Italia, and it is part of the British Council's Museums Revisited programme. The British Council is the UK's international organisation for cultural relations and educational opportunities. We support peace and prosperity by building connections, understanding and trust between people in the UK and countries worldwide. We do this through our work in arts and culture, in education and in the English language. In Europe, our Museums Revisited programme helps us build these connections and trust by supporting museum professionals across the region in sharing skills and knowledge and developing new networks. And I'm really delighted that museum professionals have joined us today from many different countries. In addition to online events, each year we organise the Co-Museum Conference. It takes place in Greece in December, when we convene museum professionals from across the globe to share their expertise. And you can find more information on our previous conferences online at thecomuseum.org, thecomuseum.org. Today we are focusing on a museum based in Scotland. And I'd like to thank our partner Ecom Italia for their collaboration, our speakers Laura Bold and Caroline Curry, our interviewer Margherita Sani, and lastly thanking you for joining us today for what will no doubt be a fascinating conversation. I shall now pass over to the President of Ecom Italia, Michele Lansinger. Michele, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. And dear Rachel, dear Caroline Curry and Laura Bold, dear organizer and dear member of Ecom Italia. I'm particularly happy with the possibility of offering a brief greeting to this important moment of updating on the themes and of interpretation in a museum context. The webinar, as already said, is a collaboration between Ecom Italy and the British Council's Museum Revisited program. The Museum Revisited program is a capacity building program designed to enable cultural exchange for international connection and create a stronger network among cultural institutions in the European Union and United Kingdom, while exploring the role of museum society today. And thanks very much to Alison Driver of the British Council for proposing this important topic to Ecom Italy. Thanks to Margherita Sani for helping us to develop it and for the contacts with Caroline and Laura. And thanks to all the Ecom Secretariat for following up on its organization. The theme we will develop will be what the approaches and methodologies are used in interpretive work when applied to a museum display, and the case of the Burrell Collection is truly significant. It's truly significant, the example that we are going to follow. Thank you very much. For my part, interpretation is like bringing the object of our interpretation back to life. And it is a narrative form that has at least three objectives, I guess. I think cognitive goals, emotional goals, and behavioral goals. I care particularly about the last aspect, an interpretation aimed at provoking changes in our public in the sense of respect of heritage, its appreciation, its entry into the notion of common goods, an objective of transformation and improvement of society through the appreciation of art and of the themes dealt with by museum that constantly led us to read our past to draw nourishment of ideas for our future. Thanks to all of those who are participating in this meeting, And thanks again to the precious evidence from the Burrell Collection that Caroline and Laura are going to give us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we can start. And I'm delighted to facilitate this session this afternoon, session on interpretation, focusing on the Burrell Collection. And let me first of all spend a few words about the Burrell Collection, which is one of the 9 museums which make up the Glasgow Museum organization. So it's 9 museums in the city of Glasgow. The Burrell Collection is one of them. And the collection was a gift of Sir William Burrell and his wife, who donated 9,000 objects to the city of Glasgow in 1944. And among those objects, it's a very varied collection. So there's medieval arts, stained glass, Chinese art, one of the most significant in the UK. There's arms and armor and tapestries, and also paintings of renowned French artists, including Manet, Cézanne, and Degas. The museum opened to the public in 1983, so clearly it was time for a renovation after some years, and this renovation started in 2016. So actually the museum closed in 2016 for 5.5 years, and it reopened exactly 1 year ago, right? 1 year ago in March 2022. And since then, it's had over 500,000, actually 580,000 visitors. This project of renovation was meant to repair the building, but was also used as an opportunity to revisit the displays and make the museum accessible for all people from different points of view, intellectual, physical, and so on. And so, in fact, a lot of emphasis was given to working with the community in order to redisplay the collection. And we will now get into the topic and start this conversation with the 2 of the protagonists of this major endeavor, Laura Bold and Caroline Curry. Laura is a curator of decorative arts, 1603-1800, and Caroline is learning and access curator. They both worked on the redisplay of the Burrell Collection. And so I would ask you, Caroline and Laura, to take us on a journey, on the same journey that you embarked on in 2016, when the renovation started. The journey, we could say, that starts when a decision is taken to redisplay a collection, from that moment to the moment in which the doors open for the public. And because I understand that the role played by the community is so important in your case, the first question is, how did you work? How did you engage the community? So how did you identify and then recruit and then involve the people who work with you? How did these working sessions play out? What happened? So please, let us get behind the scenes of what happened when you started working on the community to redisplay the collection.
Hi everybody. So I'd like to talk about how we worked with local people, communities, and visitors and non-visitors to the museum. We knew before we closed that we had a very constant demographic. We had very much of the same group of people coming every week, and it meant that our visitor numbers were not as high as they could have been. But we also knew there was lots of the community who were not coming to the museum. So we embarked on a large operation of visitor research, where our visitor studies team spoke to visitors, non-visitors, spent time in local high streets, doing surveys, questionnaires, and just generally finding out what are the barriers to your visiting a Glasgow museum, and in particular the Burrell Collection. So we had that information that we knew why people weren't coming. We found out the the subjects that they were most interested in. And from that, we were able to design a content framework that took into account all of the visitor feedback we'd had to that point. Over the course of the 6 years, we worked with roughly about 16,000 people on various, from really quick interactions right through to more in-depth work. And that meant that if people wanted to be involved, they could at a level for which they were ready for and what was right for them. People were involved in how we designed the displays. We spent a lot of time with a group of people known as the Access Panel, of which you can see a meeting of at the bottom of the screen with a lady called Gillian in her wheelchair. She was part of a group who would meet when we needed some feedback or on a semi-regular basis, and we would ask them questions such as, is this idea that we've got, does it work for you? Is this the right kind of toilet for this facility? Is this height too high or too low? Are the colours working for you? Is how we have written this particular piece of text, does that make sense to you? And we took back all of the feedback from the Access Panel, which does not just include people with physical disabilities, it includes anyone who may have some sort of access need. For example, poverty, sensory impairments. We had a few sign language users on the panel, people with strokes, dementia, people who had found a barrier because in other situations that maybe they weren't felt welcome in other venues. So we had representatives from LGBT groups. We would absolutely involve as many people as possible, and we used that feedback to ensure that it fed into the design, the content development, and we showed those groups that that feedback was being taken seriously. So we worked with a great number of people. It says 15,000 there, but it is closer to 16. And we had some really long-term projects with a number of groups. The top picture there is Wing Hong Chinese Cultural Centre, who were able to share their lived experience of some of the objects we only knew the academia about. And they were able to help us understand the true meaning behind the object from a lived perspective. And that has fed into how we now think about the objects. The group down below is one of 5 partner schools who we have worked so hard with over the last 6 years, and they are now 6 schools worth of pupils who are ambassadors for the Burrell Collection. Each school has about 200 pupils, so we have over 1,000 people, children in the local area who see the museum as their museum. They helped us bring the objects to life and also helped us write the school programme, for which now schools Glasgow-wide are booking into. We also worked with 3 community groups to develop handling boxes of real museum objects, which we used to go out and visit other groups with. We knew that if we chose the objects, it would be objects that we liked and were great, but we wanted the actual visitors who we wanted to target to choose them, so that there was an input from our local community. And finally, we worked with a good number of groups to create our permanent displays. Now, some museums have temporary community displays that change regularly and are great, but we really wanted to show our commitment to our local communities and to help bring underrepresented voices into the museum and tell the stories that the academic texts don't tell. So we worked with about 15 groups to create displays that really share that lived experience. And Laura's going to talk to you now about one that she was really involved in.
So hello everyone, I'm going to speak of a case study of one of the community collaborated projects that Caroline was speaking of, the creation of a display within the museum. I was the curator that helped to facilitate this community display. And I actually think in the first instance, that's something that's quite rare within the museum world, that a subject curator would be involved with community groups directly. I think sometimes it's left to our colleagues in learning or engagement, but we actively understood that every member of the Burrell team had to be involved with these community collaborations. We had to be visible to the community and open up our doors to them on all levels. So as Caroline was saying, we wanted to represent histories that were often underrepresented within the museum. And LGBT histories are one of the most hidden histories within the UK museum world. So we wanted to work actively with the LGBT community in Glasgow to create displays that looked at LGBT histories in the past. And one of our displays was curated by a group called LGBT Age, which was a group of individuals aged 50 or over who identified as LGBT. Now, in order to start creating our exhibit, we would approach the group. So we approached LGBT Age and we actually visited them outside of the museum. We went into their space, told them about our project, and hoped that they would have enthusiasm to come and work with us. We really wanted to create a display on LGBT history with them, but if they turned around to us and said, we don't want to do that display, we want to do something completely different about the art we love in the collection or something that they valued, then we would have facilitated that for them, because for us, it's about making the community feel welcome and giving them opportunities within the museum. It's not just about what the museum can get from the community. And that was a very important lesson that we had to hold dear as we went through all these projects with our community groups. So with this group, they did want to look at LGBT histories, and they chose this German brass dish. It's about 400 years old. And in the center, it shows the Christian saint and martyr, Saint Sebastian, who over many years has become, to some in the LGBT community, a gay icon. And they understood this saint as that. So they wanted to create a display that looked at that history. On the slide here, you can actually see the label that they ended up creating for the display of this dish within the museum. For the creation of this label, we held numerous sessions with the community group. We invited them to the museum. They got opportunities to actually see the object, to do some object handling. And we also gave them training on how to write object interpretation, on how to write for different types of audiences, and how to use accessible language to get your point across to the visitor. And what they were able to do was to bring their own personal lived experience to this object and to basically interpret it in a way that we as a museum would never have been able to. And I think that's the real value of working with community groups, is that they are able to bring a whole different interpretation to an object, to see it with fresh eyes, and to really create a new way of engaging with the visitor. And we've had so much positive feedback from people on this label. It's really promoting people to see things with different eyes, as the community group have said in their label. So that's just one example of how communities have been given a voice within the museum and have helped to shape the stories we tell within it.
And if I can add, as Laura said, at the very beginning of the project, we felt it was really important that everybody was on board working with community groups, so much so that we invested time in training our staff to get used to working with groups, because that's quite a skill. You either are good with a group or you're not. And we wanted to help our curators who had specialised in various different subjects feel comfortable with the different types of group work techniques that we would use, so that even if they were not leading the session, they knew what we were doing, why we were doing it, and how it would get people to the main aim. And it really has made a difference. There are staff who worked on the project years ago who are still using those techniques, and as a matter of course are involving community groups in their work even when they're not required to now. So it's been a great success.
Yes, it's remarkable what you're saying, not only for the numbers, 15,000, 16,000, for the number of years that you worked with these community groups and the different groups they represented, the variety of people they represented. So, I mean, there will be time to go into this during the question time. And also, I would just like to mention what Laura said, that she went out to the community. She talked to the people. She actually worked in a different capacity as compared to what she normally does. She's a curator and she became an outreach officer. So there is a lot that can be discussed, but because you mentioned, Laura, the choice of the object by the LGBTQ plus group, talking about a redisplay, I imagine you had to, well, not to discard, but possibly to put some objects in storage, to use other objects to actually make a selection. So in making that selection for the new redisplay, I imagine, again, that some of the objects were chosen by the community, by your visitors and non-visitors. That's also another interesting topic that we will touch on later on. And some by the curators, by the content specialists. How was that ratio? And how did this negotiation process play out? And which interpretive techniques did you choose to bring new life to the collections, and why?
I think the first thing that really struck me when I joined the project in 2016 was that we were focusing on that visitor feedback that really framed the content and the objects we were choosing. Glasgow Museums, as an organisation that runs the Burrell Collection, also has a very strong track record of displaying objects in a cross-collection way. So we tend not to display objects taxonomically, so by type. Instead, we try and find connections with different themes, different stories, with different objects across different cultures, times, and places. Because what we find is our visitors, those common themes are something that the visitor can get a window into that object, and it opens up those objects to them. Caroline, I don't know if at this point you maybe want to speak more about the interpretation methods, because I know you worked very closely on some of these aspects within the museum themselves.
Yes, I think it's important to say here that our approach to working as a team was very multidisciplinary. Right from the start, a team was created per gallery space that involved the subject curator, a learning and access curator, someone from the visitor studies team, and at the early point, someone from the digital team. And we all together created key messages and worked together on the object selection when the community wasn't involved. And it was that multidisciplinary approach that followed us the whole way through the project. So at any point when we worked on a particular exhibit, that team would come together again to decide what the best type of interpretation, language, and way of working would be. So we had a number of different types of interpretation that we used depending on the audience that we were aiming the display in the exhibit at. And there's some examples on this screen. So we were very, very keen that we allowed people to engage as much as possible. And the bottom two on my right are ones that people can really engage with. So we have 30 instances of tactile labels, and those are labels where there is some sort of resin element that highlights part of what the object is. Maybe it's details from an object, or it's just something that we know those who learn better through touch will get an experience from. There's also a number of fun puppet theatre style interactives that bring the tapestries to life. And these were aimed at a younger age group so that visitors could see the fish jumping out of the tapestry, or can play a game of hockey that is seen in the tapestry behind them and bring it to life for them. But it has also been a benefit to other audiences. For example, I took a visually impaired group around the museum a couple of months ago, and they told me that this meant for the first time they could actually engage with a tapestry. They could actually see it because of how it was lit and it was made to come to life. We've also used quite a lot of digital in the museum, and it's a very sympathetic digital, so it does not take over. The colours in our digital match the colours in our objects, and they are all designed to bring the object to life but not distract from it. The one that you can see in the top picture refers to prints and pastels and different works on paper that surround it. And from that, you can either use the big magnifying glass that you can see on the face to highlight a technique that the artist has used, or you can use your finger to create the same types of marks that the artist would have made. So there's lots of different ways in for people. And just below that, the bronze, that is, we had a bronze commissioned that we want to encourage people to touch, which is the same as one of our Rodins. And that way, visitors who cannot see well, who can't engage through the glass, can have an experience in the museum with an amazing piece of art. So our interpretation isn't just the labels. The labels are important, and they're all written collaboratively as a multidisciplinary team. There is also the tactile labels, things you can touch, big screens where you can stand in front of it and become an Egyptian wearing the clothes of an object. We really try to bring the collection to life in multiple different ways for different people who learn in multiple different ways. And that's really key for us to ensure that people who learn differently can still engage, because it's not all about reading labels on walls. And I know that's quite a brave thing to say to a group of museum professionals, but actually the best engagement we've seen in the museum has been from people not reading. It's been from people engaging and touching and then going straight back to the object to see what's happening with it.
Anything else you want to add to this, Laura?
Just to add to what Caroline said, I think as a subject curator, someone who has been more involved with objects than people originally, to bring in these new ways of interpretation, a digital screen, a tactile, I will be honest and transparent and say that sometimes there was hesitancy or anxiety within that subject curatorial team about, will this detract from the artwork that we are looking at? Will it take away from the experience of engaging with the physical piece of art in front of you? But as Caroline said, it only supports and helps that engagement, and it just enriches the experience of the visitor. And there's a great delight in seeing the work we've done as a team, all those different team members coming together to create this moment of almost magic in the museum where suddenly it clicks for the visitor. This is what this art piece is like. This is what it's about. And that's because of the digital screen they're engaging with or the tactile they're touching. It's really opened up my way of understanding visitor engagement as a subject curator. And I think that's something that a lot of my subject curatorial colleagues, we've come to learn working on this project, that it's not just about writing and text and labels on walls.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And because you mentioned that, so the satisfaction you had when seeing the final result, how people reacted and how people could engage with objects in a way that had never done before. My next questions to you would be, yes, what was the final outcome of all this? Which feedback did you have and how did you collect feedback, if you did? And also uncomfortable questions like, if you had to do it again, what would you change? And were there failures? Which ones? Failures from which you learned, things that you would do differently. And also for those listening this afternoon, any advice you would like to give to colleagues that want or would consider using a similar methodology, maybe on a smaller scale, and I imagine with a smaller budget, any tips that you would give. So lessons learned that you would like to share with us this afternoon.
So we have had a lot of feedback, and a lot of it has been organic, where visitors have chosen to share that with us. And also we have just, I hope you've understood that we really take visitor feedback really seriously. And we have just commissioned and received the results of a piece of evaluation where we have really looked into whether all of the methods of interpretation we've spoken about, and some that we haven't, have worked. And we have a document now that tells us what is working for people, what isn't working so well. And we also are able, because much of it is digital, to work out what the stats and the interaction with many different things are. I don't understand how that all works because I'm not a digital expert, but we are able to receive the results and know what gets the best uptake and for how long things are being used for. There is some that haven't worked so well. For example, we created a group of digital labels where each label was on an iPad next to the display, and it had a lot of in-depth information about each object. There was contextual images and in-depth close-up images, and we tested these so much before the museum opened. They were on the floor for a good couple of months. They're barely being used. So as a result, those particular labels are being revisited and being made even more accessible and more colourful and more engaging. So we are learning as we go, and we're not afraid to try something. And if it's not right, we will do what we can to fix it. You can see on the screen some of the social media visitor feedback. This is a very small snapshot, but the feedback has been that it is accessible for people. The level of information is fine. People are enjoying being encouraged to talk, but most of all, importantly for me, is the emotional impact that the museum's having. And the middle tweet you can see there is from one of those underrepresented groups actually feeling seen, included and wanted in the museum. And that is something that we are really thankful has worked. A lot of the feedback is that we now feel included, we are welcome. The staff training that we've done has made people feel welcome. It's been a really rounded thing, that it's not just about putting the display on the floor. The staff training has to support that. Laura, have you got anything to add to that before our tips?
I think Margarita asked about lessons learned or things we might do differently. One of the things I would maybe advise or things we think about now with hindsight is when we were doing the community displays, we worked very closely with the community group and within our content multidisciplinary team. And we all were there to support that community. But we also worked with an external design company. And it got to the point where we would hand over the display to them to create physically within the museum. And sometimes, because the external design company didn't understand it was a community display, there were maybe changes that they made from an aesthetic perspective that didn't align with the community desires for the exhibit. And that sometimes meant that we would have to go back to the community group to explain to them these changes, or then to try and work with the external designers to make sure that it reflected the community group. So my piece of advice would be, whoever is working on that display, they all need to understand the value of the community input. And I think if we had started again, we might have sat down in the room with the external designers to speak about the importance of the community displays and making sure that they were exactly how we needed them to be. Because I think it created a lot more work when we had to go back and revise. So make sure everyone is on board and on the same page when it comes to working with communities. So it's a great and smooth experience for that community group, most importantly. But we'll move on to our top tips, Caroline. And I think you're going to start us off.
Yes, the access panel is so important for us. And it's something that you can easily do, even if you don't have a big capital project budget like we did. This was a case of bringing together interested people who can't visit for whatever reason, who think there are barriers, and just asking opinions. In the main, it cost us a cup of tea and a taxi for each participant. And we would bring them in, give them some refreshments, and just talk to them about what our plans are. But also, if you have an access panel, you have to commit to listening and doing something with that information, and it not being lip service, not being tokenistic. And I think we're at a stage, because we've had an access panel in Glasgow museums for over 10 years now, that it's known that when they speak, we will listen. And it's because of the access panel, we now have display guidelines that work for wheelchairs, visually impaired visitors, visitors with different sort of hearing impairments, who speak different languages. And we get that information from them, which is brilliant. Nothing for them without them.
So our second top tip is about creating space for those community groups. I think sometimes there is a tendency to think that a community project needs to lead to a display or an exhibit. But if you're a museum that potentially has, budgetary restrictions, sometimes doing things like that isn't possible. So there are other ways to involve your community groups. It could be that you work with them to develop a public event, maybe a tour on something that they are interested in exploring within the museum. It's about creating an opportunity that best suits the community group and making sure that whatever their outcome is, so what they want to get out of the museum, that you are facilitating it. But there are ways of doing it that doesn't just mean creating a display. So open yourselves up to those different possibilities, and it will help to build great relationships with community groups.
And next, community voices are a very important part of the process, and we feel, and again, I'm saying everything controversial, we feel that a community voice is just as important as a curatorial voice, that they bring with them a level of understanding about an object or a subject that we could never have from an academic perspective. And if we can bring both of those perspectives together, then it really works best for the exhibit, because we are satisfying those who need that academic knowledge, but also those who come in who are from a certain community or who don't know anything about that community can see themselves or feel that they understand people better. And if it's about changing behaviour and museums changing lives, we can't do that with academic texts.
Yep. And I think that brings us nicely onto our fourth one, which is that when you do these community projects, you might have a set output. It might be that display or that talk or the tour, but there has to be an understanding that even though that project is finished, you've built a relationship with that community, and there has to be a legacy of continuing that relationship. There has to be an open door policy. You have to keep maintaining those bridges that you've built with that community group and always make them feel that it is a welcome and inclusive space. So one of the things we did recognize when we got to the later stages of the project was that many of our staff were temporary members of staff, and they had worked with some of these community groups. So when it came to the point where the project was finishing, but the museum as a venue was opening, we made sure to introduce those community groups to permanent members of staff who could continue those relationships and be a point of contact for those groups in the future if they were coming back to the museum just to visit or to work on a new project. There was always someone there that would welcome them into the museum and maintain the friendships that we had created.
And the last point is understanding what your audience and who your audience are. And we have done that through years of research into audiences. I work in a team of learning and access curators who all have their own specialism into what type of audience that they know about. So it's about sharing that information and being generous with your knowledge, and then extending that to non-learning staff. So much time was spent at the beginning of the project with our subject specialists and the type of things that an early years visitor and their parents would enjoy as a member of the visiting the museum, so that when we are thinking about what that exhibit might be, they have that anecdotal, academic, research knowledge into dwell time, how they approach museums. You know, we really spent our time in understanding who our audience was, who they are not, and what they want from us before we moved forward. And I think that is really important. And that's been shown by the feedback you saw earlier from some of the people who are autistic. They truly believe that we have designed the museum with them in mind. We didn't. We just knew enough about that audience to make sure we considered many different types of audiences while we were designing the museum.
Yeah, it's amazing if visitors feel they belong to the museum. There is this sense of belonging. I mean, if you have achieved that, that's a big achievement. And of course, yes, you have been generous with your audiences, but also generous with each other, I think, for the time you spent with each other and sort of like blending this group, this multidisciplinary group of professionals that had, I believe, to change their perspectives as they went along and embrace those of others. Thank you. This is the main, part of our webinar that we have accomplished so far. And we have questions that have come through the chat. I will start with an easy one, so to say, then I have a long one that I will read out to you. One is, how many sections are there in the museum and how many objects are displayed? Approximately, maybe not the objects, but the sections. And also for me, the question is, how much can we see online? What kind of impression? I mean, can we, in fact, I've visited the website, but can we have an idea of the variety, the richness, and so on, if we visit the museum online?
So I know the stats, so I can answer that question. We have 24 galleries, 1 accessible store, and 2,153 interpreted objects on the floor. The rest are in the store, which you can still see, but they are not interpreted. The website is going through a process, but we do have a service called Collections Navigator, where you can see every object from the Burrell Collection. On that, they all have catalogue entries and information written by our curators. If you want to dip your toe into the Burrell Collection, on burrellcollection.com, there is a top 30 objects, and that top 30 was chosen by a multidisciplinary team midway through the project. And that gives a good flavour of everything that we have in the museum.
Yes, another question coming now through the chat. Thanks for a great introduction to your interesting collaboration with the community. The question is, how do you measure success? You did speak about the evaluation. Did you set criteria before the whole operation started, or as you went along? How do you measure success?
Well, for the community groups in particular, when we started with each group, we would sit down with their group leader and we would write down what the group wanted their outcomes to be, not just, whatever they were making in the museum, but if it was, they wanted to be more confident, or they wanted an opportunity to meet people or develop skills, we would make sure that that was part of the offer that we were creating for them. And then at the end of the collaboration or the co-curation project, we would sit down with their group leader and just have a conversation as to whether they felt that, we had met those outcomes they wanted. And most of the time, I think, if not all the time, we had met those for the community group. And success for me is seeing those community members come into the museum with their family, with their friends, for social visits, and they're proudly showing off their work. This is a place where they feel that they're a part of the building, but they're also welcome here and they're valued. So, but I don't know if, Caroline, there's other markers you might want to mention with the evaluation specifically.
Every exhibit has a key message, which we are able to measure if people have understood or not, but also a learning outcome, which can sometimes be have learned new skills, have learned something new, or simply had fun. And we're able to measure, when we did our evaluation, how much of that was working, and it was a positive evaluation. We need to do some more in-depth evaluation about those learning outcomes, but the markers are in place so that we can do. But one huge marker of success is the amount of repeat visits that we have. We see so many of the same faces visiting on multiple occasions, either for the programming that we offer, or because they have a favourite interactive exhibit that families want to go and experience.
And is there free admission to the museum? That's question.
Yes.
Yeah. So repeat visits are not a problem, say, for people. Yeah,
No.
right. Yeah. So are those markers or performance indicators, whatever you want to call them, are they available? Did you develop a framework? Is there anything that you can share with us later on and that we can also share with our listeners or with our community of museum professionals here?
We followed the Art Council for England's generic learning outcome framework, but we also added a number of generic social outcomes that it's encouraged that you create your own social outcomes and not follow ones that have been preset. And those social outcomes are things like encourage dialogue between families or help understanding of a new culture. So I can absolutely share them with you.
Thanks, that would be very welcome. Thank you. Now, I'm going to read out the long question, which is very much about digital technologies. Did the co-creation process with the community also include the creation of a personal mobile interactive digital tool or with personal mobile interactive digital tools? What kind of digital tools do your communities prefer to use? Tablets, smartphone, audio guides? Have multidisciplinary hackathons been created? How did you consider the usability and sustainability of the tools, the content to be shared, and the type of user interaction with museum content during the visitor journey to create user-generated content? So this is also a question that looks further on and looks at how these solutions will be sustainable, will age, and will have to be rethought and recreated in time.
So that's a big question, and it's not really something that both Laura and I can answer in depth, but I can give you a short answer for it. So we have a digital team that, as a legacy of the project, are employed at Burrell to keep on top of all of the maintenance and new creation of new content. Before we started, some of our visitor studies looked into habits of visitors using mobile technology within the venue. And all feedback at around 2015, when we started thinking about this project, was that visitors wanted to interact with the museum and not really make use of their phone or their own tablet or device whilst they were in the museum. So with that in mind, all of our digital interventions are large scale or tablet based and are part of display structure. Since we've opened, however, we have worked closely with Bloomberg Connect, and that is an app that allows us to create various different types of content. For example, different tours and audio tours of our venue that we can easily change very quickly. I am working on a visually described tour for our visually impaired audiences. I know Laura's done some tours, and there's also the capacity to put on some tours in sign language video content on the app, but that is a work in progress. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that's the best I can do without being part of the digital team.
And because also we want this to be a peer learning event, if okay with you, we can share your contacts with the people who asked this person who asked this question, and maybe people who will have other questions in the future. If that's okay, we continue the exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that came through the registration forms is about small children. How do you work towards ensuring that very small children also get something out of the museum? Was that a concern?
No, because we understood exactly what small children needed from the museum from our understanding of that audience. And we committed right at the start to have at least 25% of our exhibits aimed at that audience. So any interactive that are for that audience is at the right height. In the picture that you can see in the top left corner, you can see some paintings are displayed quite low down. That is exactly because that is an early year story. And we wanted young people and small children to really engage with the art. So young children are not a concern at all, because I'm quite excited about that. Young children have a great time at the Burrell.
Yes, you had already in a way catered for small children. Sorry, Laura, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to say that as a subject curator, being told, you know, you're going to have to write this label for children under the age of 5, it was quite a daunting prospect in the beginning. But working in that multidisciplinary team meant that we felt supported always with our visitor feedback, with Caroline's knowledge as like learning and access and education. And actually the best labels and the most fun labels that I wrote were the ones that were for the early years, for young children, because they just allow you to be creative. They allow you to look at objects in different ways. So I would say if there's anyone out there who's more of an academic subject specialist, embrace writing for families and for early years, because it really can bring your collection alive in really fabulous ways. They're always so fun.
Right. So I think our time is almost up. And if I have to just sum up what I learned, I think I'll go home with some key messages. One is getting to know your audience, getting to know your visitors and non-visitors. So I was quite impressed by your non-visitor research that you started with also at the beginning, working with them in a participatory way, which you clearly explained, and being together in this multidisciplinary team. I think that was really key, adapting to each other, learning from each other. We haven't gone into the upskilling, reskilling that you hinted at some point that you had to do, that you had to go through this training, right? But that was probably also very important. So I would very much like to thank you, Laura and Caroline, for being with us this afternoon. I would also like to thank the audience. This webinar will be online, available for further viewing. I would also like to thank the interpreter, and of course ICOM Italy and the British Council that made all this available. And I hope we will keep in touch. We will navigate the website of the Burrell Collection, and if possible, we will come and visit it physically. So thank you, Laura and Caroline, and thank you to all, and have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.